welcome. I am very surprised that people still come back after last time, but well, we'll see how long you keep doing that. Let me share my screen, and then I am supposed to have a presentation as well, I think. There. This is the second session on JavaScript. I promised that I was going to start with what we did last week, but I don't want to spend much time on it. So I'm just going to prepare together with you to write some JavaScript this time. And the way we're going to do that is the same as what we did last week. So we need this Visual Studio Code thing. I am back into this folder that I created last week. So for the cafe with our session 1 folder in there. And if you remember, what I said is you can save this as a workspace. If you did that, then you should be able to just double click on the workspace and you'll get back to this window. If you double click on the workspace, I've noticed that sometimes it might actually add an additional item here in the tree. That's not a big issue. It's just how Visual Studio Code works. But what I'm going to do is select this cafe folder, and then rather than creating it on in the Finder, I'm going to click on New Folder, and we'll call this, we'll be very, very creative, and we'll call this session 2. Yeah. So that gives me a folder to play with. That's what we did last week as well. And then what I said is, okay, this is just a folder. We then need a file in there, and we need to convert it into a Node.js project. And if we remember, that was also relatively simple, and I'm going to do that all in Visual Studio Code. So create a new file inside of your session 2 folder. Make sure it's inside of there, and you can give it whatever name you want, but you will need to specify the right name afterwards, and the default is index.js. So if you do that, then you don't have any additional work afterwards. So that gives me this index.js, and same as last week, I'm just going to put something in there that will be executed. And we haven't seen what this exactly does, but you can guess. So console.log in there. And now I need to convert this folder into Node.js. If you remember how to do that, I need my command line tools for that. So I'm going to right click on session 2 and then say open an integrated terminal. And that gives me this terminal window at the bottom here. That should be opened in your session 2 folder. So if I'm actually not sure whether this works on a PC, but if on a Mac I type pwd, print working directory, it should tell you that you're now inside of the session 2. Okay. So what do I need to do to convert this into a Node project? I'm going to use the Node package manager, npm, and the command that we need is init. Just run that. And this will ask you a bunch of questions. We've seen that. So session name, we're happy with that. The version number, description, we don't care. Entry point, and this is the important one. So if you did something else than index.js, then you need to specify that name over there. I just did the default, so I can say, okay. Test command, we're not interested. Git repository, we're not interested. No keywords. I'm very vain, so I will type my name as an author so that we have something in this file that will be created. License is not important, and then it will ask you, is this okay? And you should say yes to that as well. And what gets created in that folder, in the session 2 folder, then is package.json. Yeah? This specifies the parameters of the Node.js projects. And one of the nice things in there are these scripts that we can run. And by default, it creates a test script. And the test script in this case would just answer, there is no test specified. That's because that's how we answered the questions when this was created. But what I can do now is add something more useful in here. And more useful in this case would be a new script. So I'm going to end this one with a comma. And then on the next line, I'm going to create a dev script. And the dev script, just as what we did last week, is Nodemon index.js. As I explained last week, this dot slash that you have here might actually not be necessary in some environments. This just explicitly says, look in the current folder for this index.js file. And I know that on some platforms, it will find that index.js file anyway. And Nodemon was the application that we used last week to continuously run our JavaScript so that we don't have to save it and then go to our integrated console window here or terminal window and type a bunch of commands to run it. We want that to go continuously, and we used Nodemon for that. Now, when you've done that, when you've added that, you can save the package.json, but we can't run it yet because we haven't installed Nodemon. You remember perhaps that we did that on the command line as well. It is possible to install Nodemon globally so that it would be available for every project. But I found at least some explanation that it's usually better to install it locally for a particular project. And that would mean I need to do this again. So I'm going to clear my terminal. And now I'm going to install Nodemon. So npm install. What do I want to install? Well, Nodemon. And then I want to install it as a development tool, not a production tool. And that was the only magic bits that we had to add. So when I add save dev as a command line parameter, then it's going to be installed as a development tool and not as a production tool. When you run that, you should see that npm goes out on the internet and does a bunch of magic stuff. It created in our package file a dev dependency, just as we asked for. The dev dependency is Nodemon, and it installed the current version of Nodemon, the current stable version of Nodemon, I should say. And it did that because we didn't specify what version we wanted. So because we have no preference, it takes the current stable version. And I can clear this again. And so our package JSON is correct. We got an additional package lock JSON. If you look in that, you'll see that there is a whole bunch of stuff in there. So this is housekeeping stuff for Node.js. And I also now have a Node modules folder with lots of stuff in here. And one of the tools in there will be our Nodemon. So I can close all of that. I'm going to leave this index.js open, and that should actually be it. So if you want, you could see whether something is missing by doing npm update. That shouldn't really do anything, and npm install by itself shouldn't really do anything either because we just installed all the latest versions. Yeah. Now, how do we run this thing so that we can get going with real JavaScript this time? Well, we run it by running a script in our Node project. So that would be npm again, the Node package manager. The command this time is run. And then we want to run a script. And those scripts are in the package JSON. That's what we added in there. We called it dev in here, but you can add as many scripts as you want, and you can give them any name that you want. That's really not all that important. So in my case, it's called dev. So I will say npm run dev. And if I was good, then Nodemon will now start. So what you see at the bottom is that it started Nodemon. Let me remind you what that does. It is automatically going to watch all folders and subfolders in my session2 folder. So anything that is inside of the session2 folder is going to be watched. It is watching files with an extension JS, MJS, and JSON. That is good for us. It is not good in all cases, but you can modify that list. You could exclude certain folders, or you could add additional extensions. And then every time it sees a change, so if I modify my file and I save it, then Nodemon spots that and will automatically run my index.js file. And of course, my index.js file doesn't do very much. It just writes out one line, but now we're in a position to experiment a little bit and put other stuff in there. And then every time we say save, it will automatically be executed, which gives a very quick turnaround for creating stuff. Now,
David, one
yes.
information: if for all of you that want to have a real-time feedback while you are typing, there's a plugin for VS Code called Quokka that runs while you type. So yeah, you see the output immediately before you change it, before you save it. Just for the ones that want to go one level deeper.
Yeah, good point. It drives me nuts when it does that, but different people have different tastes. So yes. So let's look at JavaScript now that we have something. Like I said in the beginning, if you get stuck with something, then just raise your hand and talk to me, and we will try to resolve that. But I think it's time that we actually start doing something. And what I prepared for today is, and we'll see how far we get, and maybe we can get a little further than what I prepared, which would also be good. But what I prepared for today is to start looking at the JavaScript language itself. And we're going to start with comments. And the reason for that is that comments are important. Not everyone agrees with that. You're free to disagree with what I'm saying here. But if we get to the point where there is homework and you don't add comments, I will fail it. I will just give you that piece of advice right now. My experience is that comments are important. My experience is that you need to, well, most people need to write more of them than what they actually do. I typically need to write less of them, but it's something else. And what you type in comments is important as well. Yeah? If you've done development in the past, this will all be very boring and obvious. If you have not done development or written any code in the past, then I think it is important that you understand these points as well. This is not about JavaScript necessarily, it's about writing code in general. But it is one of the points where, when I look at code that is written by others, where you immediately see big issues. And the problem is that if the comments are not good, then it makes it exponentially harder to understand what the code is supposed to do. Now, how do you write a comment? I have this in the presentation as well, but it's actually nicer to do it here. So feel free to follow along, and actually I would advise you to follow along and see whether you can get the same thing going as what I have here. But there are two ways in JavaScript to write comments. First of all, before we go to the comment bits, any line that is empty is ignored. Yeah, and things can start at any point in the in a line. That is not so for all programming languages, unfortunately. Indentation can be done with either spaces or tabs. there are many style guides that will tell you that tabs are evil, and there are others that tell you that spaces are evil. I will try to stay away from all of those debates. Just be consistent if you do something. That's the only thing that I think is important. And then there are two ways to add a comment. The first one is a double slash. So anything you type after that is interpreted as a comment, but the next line is normal JavaScript code again. Yeah. But anything that I have on this line, once it is after the double slash, is a comment. So that means that I could have a line as what we had before, and that I can start my comment afterwards. Yeah. And this is a comment you shouldn't write because it says exactly the same as the code, so it's useless. In general, I don't like this style very much because I don't like it very much. But you can do it. Of course, once you have the start of a comment, there is nothing else you can write in terms of code on this line. Everything else will just be ignored. So that's a one-line comment. There is a second way of doing it, and that is and when you see this thing go red on the side here, that is because I have ESLint installed in my system, and it very often is not happy with me. So when I do something that is not good, then it will automatically indicate that I made a mistake. So the second type of comment is this, where you have a slash and an asterisk, and then you end it with an asterisk and a slash. And this is typically used for example, for the beginning of a, so you could have an explanation of what the script does, and then maybe have information about who wrote it and so on. So you can have a block of code. It is also often used at the beginning of functions. We haven't seen what functions are, but smaller pieces of code to explain what that particular piece of code does as well. So that is something that you will see as well. It needs to start with a slash and an asterisk. You can have multiple asterisks, although probably my editor is going to work against me. So something that you sometimes see as well is this kind of style where you have a delineation of part of the script, and then you have a comment that explains what it does. Yeah. All of that, once you're at that level, is a matter of style. There are some cases where having a particular style for comments is important because there are documentation tools that will look at your JavaScript file and automatically create documentation from it, for example. And very often those will need a particular format for the comments that are in there. But JavaScript doesn't care. The only thing it knows is that there are one-line comments and multi-line comments, and that everything inside is ignored. And in fact, part of them can be mixed. So I could actually have a one-line comment line in there that is totally fine. What I can't do is mix multi-line comments together. Then the JavaScript environment will get confused. When I talk about the JavaScript environment, there are multiple terms you can use. You can use the word compiler, interpreter. For JavaScript, it's supposed to be interpreter. I can't promise that I'm always going to use the right term. But basically, the thing that reads your JavaScript code and does something with it is what I mean whenever I use any of those things. So putting those together is not possible, but or at least nesting them is what I want to say is not possible for the multi-line comments. The fact that you can have this inside of a block is useful because it means I can have code and I have a reasonably simple way of commenting out all of that code. So as long as you only use one-line comments in the code itself, you can easily comment out a whole block of that thing by using multi-line comments. Then again, many editors have support for stuff like that as well. I call this a multi-line comment. That is strictly speaking not true. I can just as well have it on one line and close it down there. So that works as well. And you can do all kinds of strange things. I would absolutely absolutely suggest that you don't do that, but it is possible. And in some cases, it could actually be useful to highlight one piece of the code, for example. Yeah, and that's all there is to know, except that, well, as I said, it is important to write comments that explain what you do. It is important to write them in such a way that they mean something. And that means that you would not write, for example, console log penguins, but that you would write, I don't know, write out your favorite animal or whatever the code is supposed to do. It should be explanatory, not just copying what the code already does. You should be able to assume that if someone reads your code afterwards, they will at least be able to read JavaScript. And if they can't, then they can look that up online. Yeah? They can't look up online what your code was meant to do. So that's what you should highlight very clearly in the comments that you add. There, that was the first thing. That was not very difficult, was it? So let's talk about something that is a little bit more interesting. And I have these things in the presentation as well. I'm going to skip the majority of the presentation because I prefer doing it in Visual Studio Code and showing you different things. I will share the presentation afterwards. I'll put it in on the Facebook group for the cafe so that you can download it there as well. Main topic for today is variables. And again, I fully realize that some of you have done something with development in the past. And in that case, a lot of what I say is probably going to be similar to what you've already done. I will try to make it interesting also for people who have done some development in the past. But variables, if you haven't done anything like that, is a very important concept. And the best analogy that I've read anywhere is that a variable is a box. So basically, what you're doing is you're telling your JavaScript environment that you need a box to store something in. And it's a box with a label on it, the name. And that's, of course, is important. If you tell JavaScript to create 1,000 boxes, then it's a little bit hard to afterwards tell it which box you now want to use. So when you create this variable, you have to specify a name for it. And the box can be empty, meaning your variable doesn't contain any value in it, or it can contain a value. And usually that's why you ask for a box in the first place. It's because you have something to put in there. And the box has a type. Unfortunately, that is true for many languages. In JavaScript, and I have a very short section on type safety in JavaScript, which consists of exactly one slide that says you can forget about all that. When you deal with JavaScript, there are different types of variables and so on. But you should not think that when you ask JavaScript to give you a box, that box is automatically has a certain type, or that JavaScript is going to check anything like that for you. That's not the case. So we create a box, we give it a name, and we can put something in there. That's the extent of what a variable is. Now, let's make it a little bit more. Yes, let's make it a little bit more tangible. So how do you create a box? Well, it turns out that there are multiple ways to create boxes in JavaScript, and some are better than others. And I'll start with the oldest, and then I'll tell you not to use it unless you have to. So the oldest way in JavaScript to create a box is this. There, that gives me a box. What that does with the var keyword, and these things that turn somewhat darker blue in my theme, what the color is depends on the theme you're using in Visual Studio Code. But these things that turn a little bit darker blue are reserved words. These are words that JavaScript knows and that you use to tell it to do something. And var is one of them. Var declares a variable. So it asks JavaScript, give me a box. Which box? Well, a box with the name that I specify here. Yeah. And at this point, that box doesn't have a value. We already said that, I said last week that JavaScript lines are supposed to end on a semicolon. That is not strictly necessary, but when I save my file, it is going to, so if I would remove it and then save, my editor is going to add it in automatically anyway, because that's the way I've set it up. And usually it makes good sense to do so. So this is just part of JavaScript. It has nothing to do with the declaration of our variable necessarily. But this is an instruction to create a variable without a value. And I can do the same thing, but now initialize it at the same time. So assign a value to it by saying var, and then I'll give it a name, equal sign, and the value that I want to assign to that. Yeah. And then, of course, if we want to make this useful, I could say, write that out to the console. Yeah. Now, these two statements that you see here do three things if you look at them. The first is that it creates a box with the name favorite animal. The second thing is that it takes this piece of text and assigns it to that variable. So it opens the box and puts it inside. And then the third thing that happens here is that we use the value that was put in previously. Yeah? So the equal sign is the way to assign stuff in JavaScript. It says, take whatever I have on the right-hand side and put that into whatever I have on the left-hand side. It's a very common thing to use, obviously. And by just specifying the name of a variable that I created before, I will be able to use it again. So now my console log, and let me comment out that one we have at the top here. Now this console log will not write out a piece of text that I specify here, but instead it will look in the box called favorite animal and write it out. And the result, of course, is that I would just write out the word penguin because that's what I assigned to it. Yeah. So if I change this and I say something completely different, then it will write out that instead. So whatever I put in the box is then used in the next statement. If that doesn't make sense, please speak up. So this is a way to create variables, and this is what was in the language from the very beginning. There is a newer way, and the newer way is very similar. I should be consistent with what I do. The name is not important. I'm just going to do this. So instead of using the word var to create this, I'm using the word let. And so the way you're supposed to read this is let favorite number be 42. If that makes it easier for you to understand what's going on, you can absolutely do that. But what happens here is more or less the same as what happens here. So I'm creating a variable with the name without value again. I'm not assigning any value to it. And then here I'm creating a variable and I am assigning a value to it. When I talked before about the fact that a box has a type, well, you can see that I specify no type here, and actually I just put stuff in there, and whether it's text, as in this case, or number, as in this case, JavaScript doesn't seem to argue too much with me, and that is exactly what I meant when I said types are not important in JavaScript or are not enforced by the language in any case. So when you create a variable, when you create a box, you don't have to tell the JavaScript environment what thing you're going to put in it. That is not important. And of course, as I said, this is a variable, so I can just use it again. And now we have penguin and then 42. This will write out penguin and this will write out 42. Now, why would you have two different keywords for the same thing? Why would you have something called var to create variables and something called let to create variables? Well, the let keyword is newer than the var keyword. Yeah. So let me try something here. And let's run that. And I'm going to type something else and then I'll explain why I'm doing this. Oh, so this is kind of a different result that we're getting. So let's see what I was doing here. First of all, I created a variable called favorite animal and I put something in it. Now, this should, if you have a nicely ordered mind with lots of OCD, this should actually already insult your OCD because we already created a box like that. Yeah, we have a var favorite animal statement here, and here I'm doing the same thing. So that's kind of weird. I'm asking JavaScript to give me two variables, but these two variables have the same name. Yeah. When you're using var, old style JavaScript, then the JavaScript interpreter will let you do that. Yeah. As long as I only have that thing, I get no error whatsoever. Yeah. So whether or not you do this in old style JavaScript, the JavaScript environment doesn't care. But this is a rather dangerous thing because it means that you could create a variable here and store stuff in there. And then because you do something with the same name afterwards, it's, well, this one is kind of going to overwrite the one you had before. So in general, this is not something I would suggest you do in an application. And of course, here it looks very simple because it's on the same screen. If you have 200 lines of JavaScript that you're working on, then reusing a variable name without realizing that you're doing that is something that that could actually happen, and it's a source of problems. In old style JavaScript, that is not an issue. In new style JavaScript, the interpreter protects you from that. So what it says is identifier favorite number has already been declared and you can't declare it again. Yeah, I can use it again and put something else in it. We've already seen how to do assignment. So I could do favorite number equals 777. and fine, then I am redeclaring it. And if I want to see what's in there now, I can write it out again. So now I have my penguin line 42 because that's what we put in there. And then I reassign it to 777 and I write it out again. So I get 777. There's nothing wrong with this. What there is something wrong with is to create the same variable with the same name twice. And if you try to do that while you're using this let keyword, then the interpreter is going to give an error. And make no mistake, this is a crash. Yeah. So the interpreter says, you're stupid, bye, and you have to fix whatever it is before you can actually run your application. Now, if you haven't done development before, the first question that could come to mind is, why would you want this? I mean, if I'm writing a web server, and well, web servers are supposed to always run, and I'm doing something like this, why would you crash the application or the interpreter run in any case in this way? Isn't it better to have what you do with the var keyword, where it can overwrite and at least it doesn't crash? In general, I prefer a crash over something that is ambiguous any day. Yeah? The interpreter tells me what's wrong. That means I can fix it. In this case, where I overwrite something I declared before, the interpreter doesn't help me. It lets me do it, and I will probably figure out that I did something stupid 2 days later while figuring out why my application doesn't do what I want. So these types of checks are, I consider them to be very good. Okay, so then the next question, if this behavior is better than the behavior that you get from var, then why would you have two keywords? Why not just change the way var works and make it work properly? That's a historical reason, of course. I mean, originally, JavaScript was implemented as a very relaxed language. And once you've done that, and there are probably millions of websites using JavaScript and counting on a certain type of behavior, then you can't easily change it anymore. So what they did was, in an update to JavaScript, they added the let keyword. And when they did that, they made it more stringent, a little bit more secure than what existed in the old style stuff. Okay. So which should you use? Well, it's always better to use let and have the additional protection. It's not just this that it adds a number of other things additionally as well. I can't really go into them right now because we haven't talked about program flow and stuff like that. But it is, take it from me, it is more than just this protection that is added by let. So when you get the chance, use let to define variables. However, if you're using switch, and from this point on, I will, when I say if you're using scripting in switch, then what I mean is the old style scripting environments, switch 2019 and before. The new version uses node.js, so we'll just call that node.js. If you're using switch scripting, let is not available. Yeah. Switch, as we looked at last week, the JavaScript version in switch is something like JavaScript 4 or something that resembles that. And the let keyword was not introduced in the language. At least it's not supported by switch. So you will have to use var in that case. Anything else today, you can almost bet on it that it will support the let keyword. If you have ever done anything with the Swift language that Apple has created a couple of years ago, and that I still think is the the most well-designed language I've seen. If you have done something in Switch, what might be annoying is that the let keyword in Switch is used to define constants, not variables. And that is a bit confusing, but in JavaScript, they did something that I think makes more sense, and there is a separate thing to define a constant. And so I can define a constant, and it looks exactly the same as a variable declaration. Yeah? So third keyword, const, the name that you want to give to this constant, and the value that you want to assign. There's a few things that make a constant what it is. So I can run this and there is no issue. So what happens if I redefine my constant? I will get another crash from the JavaScript interpreter. I should say an exception from the interpreter. And what it says now is type error, assignment to constant variable. The reason that const was introduced in the language is because when you are writing code, it happens very often that you want to have a place to store something, but you know that it is not going to change. It is always going to keep its original value. And it is much better to define a constant and then use that throughout a long script than it would be to have this value everywhere in the script in multiple locations. Because if I made a typo in my definition of pi, then, and I figure it out afterwards, I would have to go through the whole thing and correct that. If I declare a constant at the top of my code, for example, once, then I can just reuse it everywhere. And if I make a typo, this is the only place where I have to fix it. Yeah. So constants can be declared, but they cannot be reassigned. Otherwise, they would not be constant. And what that also means is that if I do something like this, that, well, the JavaScript interpreter is also not happy with that. What it says now is missing initializer in a const declaration. So I'm asking JavaScript to give me a box. I'm telling it that is going to be constant. So it's never going to change value, but then I don't assign a value to it. And of course, I can't assign the value later because it's a constant. So declaring a constant, you always have to add the value to it. For a variable, you can skip that, and we'll see in a minute what that means. But for a variable, you can skip that. So you can choose between the declaration without a value or with a value. But for a constant, you have to add a value because it is not possible to do it afterwards. Yeah, so 3 ways to declare variables or to create these boxes that we can use. One is by using the var keyword. It's the old style stuff. Don't use it unless you're writing switch scripts or some other very old environment, of course. You have let to create a variable in the new way with some additional protection that you will have if you use let, and you have const to create a variable that is constant. So it's still a box, you still put a value in it, you can use it afterwards, but you cannot modify it. So I can still clearly do this, and my constant will be written out. So I can use that constant in all kinds of different ways, but I cannot modify the value. That is fixed forever.
David,
No questions?
do you mention arrays as well? Because
Yes, I will, but
okay,
later.
good.
You're way too advanced, Peter.
No, because I also had to learn that an array is, if you change the content of an array,
Yes.
you still can define it as const outside, because you only change the inside, but that's already the next level, I guess.
Value versus reference. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
We will need, unfortunately, we will need to look at that. Yeah, but these concepts are pretty straightforward. And as I said, we're already doing three different things here. We're defining something, we're actually assigning values to it, and we're using it by just specifying the name. And these things can, you can normally logically extrapolate from that and do more advanced stuff. So with the assignment and so on that we've seen, you could assume that I can do something like, I have to see that I do something that is possible now. So let the this is going to be already difficult. So the surface of my circle, I just defined pi. So that should be something like this. Yeah. Asterisk is used in JavaScript for multiplication. We'll have a look at all of the things you can use with numbers, but that's multiplication. And the rest should be relatively clear as well. I am declaring a variable and I'm using my constant that I defined before to then do something with that variable. Yeah. So the assignment that you've seen, we can use that here as well. The fact that you can use a variable by specifying its name is what we use here as well, and so on and so on. That's the negative of learning a language, is that you have to learn what the actual keywords are that you very often use and how to put them into a statement that the JavaScript interpreter will understand. The advantage is that you're learning a bunch of concepts that you can put together in different ways. And actually, if you do something with JavaScript and you understand how JavaScript works, and you would then go to another programming language, the effort to do so would be a lot smaller because the concepts translate between different programming languages without too much of a problem. So I've used names for variables. If you look on the internet, and I'm not joking, you can find religious texts from different people on how you should name variables and what you should do and not do. I won't go into that and I won't choose sides. I have my preferences. Feel free to follow them or use your own. Just be consistent if you follow your own. I will try to be consistent as well. There are a few rules that I think you should follow. First of all, don't use spaces in a variable name. Don't use hyphens as well. The hyphen is also used as a minus sign, which makes it very confusing. You can actually use underscores. I don't like that. You can use strange characters. I don't like that either. So keep them as simple as possible. Some people use underscores to make the variable more readable. I choose not to do that. Be careful for capitalization. JavaScript is a case-sensitive language. And that means that if I have animal with a capital and without, those are two different variables. Yeah. So if you mix these two things in your application, in your script, then the JavaScript interpreter is going to be completely confused because it's not going to know what you're talking about. So be careful about capitalization. What I do and what I suggest you do, but again, it's almost a religious issue, and I refuse to get involved in it any longer. I prefer to use Camel Case. Camel Case is defined as doing everything lowercase, except when you have word breaks in there. And you see some examples there. This is also what I did in the script example so far. So the first letter would be lowercase, but then if you have multiple words, those letters are uppercase. This is good for two things. First, it makes the variable more readable. And secondly, if you do that with non-developers or developers, they will immediately assume you know what you're talking about. So there's no reason not to follow it. Also, and again, different schools of thoughts, but use descriptive names. I almost never use something that is called X, Y, I, whatever, because it doesn't say what it is. Don't make your variables a novel either. I am sometimes guilty of that, I think, but I try to do better. So give them a descriptive name, what explains to you what it means, or to someone else what it means, but don't make them too long either, because that's just not practical. You can, there is Visual Studio Code does typing completion and stuff like that. So when you start typing something, it will show you the variables that you have defined, and you can just enter. But it's just, I mean, this is just too long. And don't use reserved words. What are reserved words? Well, those things that we've already seen. This is not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was this. So the reserved words are things like var, let, const, and so on. I put a link in here where you can find all of them. In most cases, you don't need that. You just type it in Visual Studio Code. And if it is colored incorrectly, you know that you're doing something that isn't correct. Yeah. So normally color coding will already tell you what's going on there. And then you'll find the same things that I've done in there, that we've done in the code as well to some extent, just so you have that as a reference afterwards. So this is the general way of declaring different variables in your code. Yeah? And now let's put this to some use. I am surprised by the fact that it is as late as it is, but well, what can I do? I told you that JavaScript isn't very big on type and on checking type and so on, and that is correct. But obviously there are different types of things you can put in a box. If it was a real box, I could put different things in there, and that's the same with variables. We've already seen two. This is a string and this is a number. Now let's look at this a little bit more detail. A string is anything that starts with a, so let me see which example did I use. The problem is I always want to use favorite animal, because I always want to do penguins. So this is the definition of a string.
You can use favorite programming language.
True, true. But actually, I'm doing something that I wouldn't do in a real script already, and I wouldn't like it if anyone else did it. I now have a variable that is called favorite animal and one that is called preferred animal. That sounds very confusing to me. So JavaScript doesn't care, but your logic or your sense of logic might care at some point. So, but a string is something that starts with either a double quote or a single quote, and it ends with one as well. And the string is everything inside of there. It's a little bit more complex, but let's start with that. So that means that I could do this, and it would also be correct. And it's actually the case. In fact, when I do save, my editor changes the single quotes to double quotes. That's simply because I have chosen to enable that in this prettier plugin that I have for Visual Studio Code. And I've chosen to use double quotes. There is in JavaScript, that is not the same in every programming language, but in JavaScript, there is no difference between double quotes and single quotes. You can use either and be as happy. You can also mix them. Now it gets a little bit confusing. So if I define something with double quotes, I can use single quotes in my string and JavaScript will not be confused. That's absolutely fine. What I can't do is use a double quote in there, because now you can see already with the color coding, you can see that something is going wrong. And what goes wrong, of course, is that JavaScript now assumes that the string goes from there to there, and then it wonders, so what is this stuff that comes behind it? Because I don't recognize that. Yeah? And you get an error. There is, of course, a way to do this, because sometimes you need to have double quotes in there. And that way is by, is by escaping it. So if I say backslash and then this double quote, then that's not going to break my string. And when I log it, so when I use this string, you can see that it writes out the single quote just fine. And this double quote, it writes out as a regular double quote. So the backslash is here to tell JavaScript that this is part of the string. It is not part of the JavaScript code if you want, yeah? But that backslash is not actually in the string itself. So when you write it out or you assign it to something else, then the backslash is ignored. It's just part of the string. I can do the same thing for the single quote, and there are a few others. You can do /n or /r, I think, and /t. So this is a new line. This is a whatever that's called. And this is a tab character. Okay? And they're all just part of the string. And you can see that, well, because I have them in there, my string gets written out slightly differently. And this is also the way of making strings that are multiple lines. So if I want to say, I want to have 2 lines, then I can just have a new line in the middle of my string. And when I write it out, it will be written out this way. Yeah. Now, the comment that was added there is a very appropriate, a very good one, and a very timely one. There is a third way in JavaScript to create strings, and it's a very interesting one. I think it looks really weird, and I haven't been using it all that long, but what I could do is I could declare a variable. And I can use what is called backticks. That is on your, should be on your keyboard somewhere. If it's not on your keyboard, you have to look at how to type them. It is not the same as a single quote. It's really a backtick. So it's a slanted version of the single quote. And when you define a string like that, JavaScript refers to that as template strings. So I can do my favorite animal is a. And the nice thing about, there are a few things that are special about a template string, and I'll show you one first of all. So I'm just going to put some breaks in there. And when I write this out, oh, I need, if I want to see it, we need to write this out. So console log. Don't worry, there are more functions in JavaScript than console.log, but it's a very useful one for what we're doing here. So when I write this out, you can see that these breaks, these line breaks, have been replicated. So they are part of the template string. That is not possible with regular strings. If I do a break in there, JavaScript gets completely confused. Yeah, and if I try to run that, it is going to tell me invalid or unexpected token. What that means is I come to the end of the line and this string isn't terminated. So I don't know what this is, so I'm giving up. So in a regular string, you can't have line breaks. You have to add them using this escape character. Yeah, in a template-based string, you can have line breaks. And this is particularly useful when you use JavaScript to, for example, generate CSS or HTML code, because you very often have to write out big pieces of text and you want some indentation in there and multiple lines and so on. With a template string, you can do that. Again, you need to use the backticks for that. There is one other very cool thing that you can do with that. Let's say that I put the same text in my string here. And well, I want to write this out, but what I want to write out, and now I get the same thing in both cases. This one and this one are now exactly the same. So what I want to do is I want to add the name of this favorite animal that I have. And so we have a variable that has something in there. So I want to use that variable and combine it with my string. Yeah. The way to do that in JavaScript is by adding them. Again, this is not the same in all programming languages, far from. In fact, it's one of the very annoying things when you switch from one language to the other, because some languages use a dot, others use an ampersand. JavaScript uses a plus, which is relatively straightforward. So this means take this literal string and add whatever is in this favorite animal variable that we defined before. And if I write that out, it now says my favorite animal is a penguin. Success. Now, this is a little bit annoying because if I want a period at the end, then I would have to do this again and then add the period, and then I have a nice string with a period at the end. So you can see that this is going to become really ugly if you want to combine different things. And template strings make that so much easier. So I'm going to add the period there at the end. And now the reason it's called a template string is because I can insert other content, variables, but actually generic JavaScript content in the middle of this thing without breaking it. Yeah? And the way to do that is by using this syntax. So I have a $sign and curly braces. And in between the curly braces, I can put whatever I want. So I can put JavaScript in there, like the name of a variable. And you can see that the color coding actually shows this correctly. This is my template string. And then at some point, it breaks it and it puts in a nicely colored variable that it recognizes because we've defined it before. And when I run this, it gives me exactly the same as what I had with the regular type string. So these two now do the same thing, but you can see that this way of creating a string with content in the middle is much more legible and much more efficient than this version. And I only have a very small text fragment. If you would want to write out an HTML element this way, for example, and you have to put it together and stuff variables and in the middle of that string, that's going to become really messy. What you're doing here is going to look relatively clean. So this by far has my preference when it comes to creating strings where you combine different things together. Of course, in switch scripting, you can't use it because this was not invented in JavaScript version 4. Yeah. So as a rule, I think you can remember that if anything is cool and useful, you can't use it in Switch. Unfortunately, that's the situation. As I said before, once you look at Switch 2020, and then you're in a Node.js world, and you can, of course, use all of these things. So now the rest of this will, because I'm going to have to end this soon, the rest of the types of variables is a lot simpler. And I can, well, I've actually already shown you numbers. Yeah, a number in JavaScript is either a complete number. It can be a negative, of course. It can be something like this pi thing that we thing that we used before. Use periods, of course, not a comma. That is not going to work. It can be a negative rational number. It can be something that has scientific notation, and that, of course, can be negative as well. Negative, David, yes. Yeah. So all of these things are supported. There are a few slightly more archaic ways of doing things that I'm going to skip for now. You can, of course, read all of the possibilities and the complete syntax online. There are many sites where you'll find it, but that's the basics. You can use numbers. Remark, and that is the important thing to remember, and it goes back to the origin of JavaScript. In many programming languages, actually, I think in just about any other programming language that I know, there are multiple types for different types of numbers. So you have something that is called int, where you can only put integer values, and you will have a real and maybe a double that has a higher precision and so on. JavaScript doesn't care. It stores everything in the same thing, and that is called a number. Whatever the value is, whether it's an integer or it's a floating point value or it's scientific notation, it all doesn't matter. Okay, so one last one for that, and then we have a few special ones, and yes, I will come to that. As in most languages, you have in JavaScript the concept of a Boolean. Boolean because it comes from Boolean logic. And a Boolean can be either true or it can be false. And you can use these keywords. It's actually safe to use these keywords. But JavaScript is not so difficult. When we talk about if statements and loops and so on, you'll see that you can use Booleans for that, but you can also use strings and numbers and generic variables. And JavaScript will do its best to interpret all these things in a certain way. Okay, so a few more. There is when we talk about types in general, we've skipped a few things, and I've already introduced one and you never knew. This one here, var variable without value. What is in this box? Well, nothing. And I could, I'm a physicist, so I could use Schrödinger's cat as an example. We actually don't know what is in the box. We haven't put anything in there, and JavaScript doesn't know either. So what does JavaScript think is the value of this variable? There is a way to test that. I can do my console log trick again. And there is an operator, well, it's shown as a reserved keyword here that is called type of. And what it writes out for this variable is undefined. So in JavaScript, if you have a variable that you haven't put anything in, like this one here or this one here, and you ask JavaScript what is in there, then the answer will be undefined. Make no mistake, this is not just something that console log writes out because it does a test and whatever. This is actually the type of the value in there. And I can use it literally. So in my variable on off, I could say, oh, I'm changing my mind and I'm going to put that to undefined. And now this variable has the value undefined. Yeah. So it's not just because you don't put a value in there, but you can actually assign that to a variable as well. And you tell JavaScript, I don't know what is in there. There is a related property. That is this one. Null. And null means I'm telling you that there is nothing in there. I'm making an empty box. But null is not the same as undefined. This is almost philosophical, but to JavaScript, this is reality. Null is not the same concept as undefined. Yeah. So if I have a variable that is not defined, and I would ask that variable, are you null? JavaScript would say no, it's undefined. So you have these two concepts, and they're not always useful, but they can be useful. Let's say that I want to write a piece of code that returns your or someone's favorite animal. Well, I could write the code in such a way that it returns undefined if I haven't asked the person yet what their favorite animal is. And if the person says, I don't have a favorite animal, I could have that return null, because then I know he doesn't have one. Yeah? And of course, if he has one, I return a string with the name of the favorite animal that they've given me. So you can use that. It's a bit delicate to use, so you would have to make sure that you really know what you're doing, and that the person, the other people using your code potentially also know what you did with that. But it is something that you can use. By the way, if you're wondering what the other answers are for types, so here, so if I have a string value, it will say string. Type of for a number will give me number, and for a Boolean, actually I wonder if I can do it this way. For a Boolean, it will say Boolean. Yeah, so you can use this type of operator to figure out what it is that you have in there. We're almost done. I'm just going to show you one thing that is horrible in JavaScript, and actually whoever decided that should be probably cut into pieces. Let me show you something that is mathematically very incorrect. So something that everyone who does mathematics knows that you're not supposed to do is dividing by 0. And in any other programming language that I know, if you divide by 0, the compiler will slap you around and say, this isn't possible, and crash or something ugly like that. JavaScript, however, is a little bit different and redefined mathematics. And so when you divide by 0, you get infinity. And infinity is an actual, again, it's like undefined and null. So if I define a variable for, and I'm putting a number in it, so let's, very big number, I could say infinity. Yeah. So this is an actual thing that you can assign to a variable as well. And that is, in essence, fine, although it's a bit of a dangerous thing. I can do minus infinity as well, by the way. So it's a bit of a dangerous thing to have this as a concept in when you're working with numbers, but fine. So this is explicitly defined, but you have to realize that when you make a mistake, a calculation mistake, and you divide by 0, you're also going to get infinity. And what do you get when you divide minus 42 by 0? You get minus infinity, obviously. Yeah. From a mathematical point of view, this is just wrong. Dividing by 0 is not defined, but well, this is what you get. And again, this is good and not good. I'm not just annoyed about this because it offends my sense of mathematics, because I don't have that much sense of mathematics. I am mainly annoyed by it because it means that, and we actually had an example of that not so long ago. It means that if you write a script and you by accident divide by a variable that is 0, then your application is not going to crash or give you something like that. No, it is going to give you infinity, and then it's going to corrupt any other calculation you do, of course, because if I do this and I then add 1, what do I get? Well, still minus infinity, because minus infinity plus 1 is minus infinity. Yeah. So you don't get an error where you make the actual mistake. If you continue to calculate with these variables, then that mistake is actually going to be propagated through the rest of the script. And you might at some point get into an issue, but that is not guaranteed. What they should have done is, there is a concept of another concept, and that is a concept of not a number, which also exists in JavaScript. So the not a number thing is also a thing, and that would have been either undefined or not a number would have been a better answer to division by 0. But just be aware that that is the case. So if you do calculations and if you write out something and you expect a number and you see infinity, well, congratulations. That means that you divided by 0 probably at some point in your script.
David, something that I don't get. I also studied mathematics, so I'm also kind of you know, feel some aggression here. But why did they do that? I mean, is there a reason why you would need this?
I think it all goes back to the origin of JavaScript, and what I think what they tried to do is make a language that was easy to use, and you see that in other decisions as well. The thing with var, the fact that you can redefine var, I think stems from the same problem. They tried to come up with a JavaScript language as a language that was very easy for people to use. And in their mind, being easy meant that you didn't cause a crash, you just handled it somehow. But as a developer, my experience is that if the language just handles it somehow, that causes really nasty things afterwards. Yeah? And obviously, I'm not alone in that sentiment. If you look at Swift, which is probably the most modern language, well, I shouldn't say that, probably the most recent language, I guess, that was developed and has wide usage. If you look at Swift, then Swift is hypersensitive when it comes to type. And the minute you do something wrong, it's going to slap you around and say, no, this is not correct. Yeah. And they've gone as far, actually Swift does the same as what you try to do with, for example, PDFX and graphic arts. It's a strange comparison, but I think it's actually valid. If you read PDFX, what they try to do in the standard is remove things that might cause a problem down the line. Yeah? So anything that could lead to a problem printing is they try to either very well define what you need to do in the PDFX standard or remove it from the PDF completely by saying you can't use this. And that is the same thing that Swift does. It requires everything to have a specific type. You can't just assign, if you say that a variable is a string, then you can't just put a number in it, stuff like that. They close it down completely. And that means that while you're writing Swift, you have to be much more careful, because when you start to run it, the compiler will smack you around and show you all the things that you've done wrong. That is not the case in JavaScript. You can write things a much more relaxed style. The problem is they then come back to haunt you and bite you 3 months later. Yeah. So I think it's design choice, and I think what you see in what I said about let and var and the differences there is you see that they kind of change their mind at some point, and many of the new features in the language move to being more restrictive. And actually, if you would look up, I had it on the slide last week, but if you would look up TypeScript, then TypeScript is based on JavaScript and does a whole lot of the same thing. But in TypeScript, you are supposed to, I don't know it, but I think it is something like this. You're supposed to define stuff. This will not work in JavaScript. Yeah, I get strange things here. But in TypeScript, you are supposed to define variables with a type so that the interpreter can do type checking for you. JavaScript doesn't really do that. And there was a remark from Jan, I think, before about numbers, for example. Well, in JavaScript, I can do things like and then I will just add the number 0 to that, and that is going to work. Even though what I'm doing is I'm adding a string with something that is a number. But in general, this is going to work. What is it going to do? It's going to convert this to a number, and then it's going to add it to the string. But of course, that means that you're not always going to get the result that you want. I mean, something very common and something that I've actually had multiple times is you say something like, well, I had my favorite number here somewhere. So let's take this one. So I say favorite number, and then I say plus 2. Yeah. And if my favorite number is 7, then that is going to work. Let's see if I can show you what exactly I mean. So what it writes out is 7. Why does it write out 7? Okay, because I shouldn't write this, of course. There. Now it writes 9. That's what I expected. Yeah. So my favorite number is 7. I'm creating a new variable, and I'm saying that is the value of favorite number plus 2, and the response is 9. That's what you expect. Now let's make it more interesting. This comes from PDF Toolbox at some point. Yeah, PDF Toolbox passes variables as strings, and I didn't notice that. And so now my answer is 72. And it is, you can explain why this happens. I have favorite number, and I say, I'm putting a string in there, the string with 1 character, 7. And then I'm adding 2 to something that is now a string. And JavaScript interprets that as, oh, you want a string. So I'm going to do the string 7 plus the conversion of this to a string, and I end up with 72. Okay. That's a very nasty bug to find, because if it is not, if it is not obvious that this is a string, then you can search for a very long time why 7 plus 2 equals 72, for example, all of a sudden. Okay. In Swift, you wouldn't be able to
to make
this.
it more interesting. PDF Toolbox will use that 7 as it is a string as a number in some cases as well.
But in some cases, it does act like a number. If I'm just using it by itself, in a place where code expects a number, then it might actually convert it back into a number for me automatically, and it will work. But in some other cases, there is an implicit conversion from this thing to, well, to string, and that's what I don't expect. Yeah, and that's why I had that slide that said type safety in JavaScript is non-existent. You can forget about it. It's not there. If I would write something like this in Swift, first of all, I would have to define a type for this. So I wouldn't be able to put a string in it because I would define it as a number. It would give me an error on that. And if I wanted to do that anyway, then I would have to do an explicit conversion from a number to a string or vice versa. And you would hope that if you have to do an explicit conversion, you would kind of go like, oh, okay, so maybe I need to think about what comes in. Yeah. So Swift tries to keep you safe. JavaScript just says, well, I'm just going to do whatever you tell me to do because I'm a very easy language. And that is nice from one point of view, but of course, especially when you write longer code, I mean, if you're in Switch and you're doing a JavaScript expression, a script expression somewhere, and it's 3 lines, and then as far as I'm concerned, you can forget all the stuff I told you about comments and whatever, even though I would still have comments in that case, but it's not important. If you write a JavaScript that is 200 lines or 1,000 lines, then that becomes a lot more important. And my experience with JavaScript is that even though it allows you to do many things that are questionable, you should not do them. Yeah? But JavaScript is not going to help you. You need to have the mental discipline to make sure that you write code in such a way that it is defensive, because otherwise you're going to pay for it at some point. You always pay for it. There.
Well, you can show how to parse that number 7 to a number.
I always forget. Tell me.
You write parse int.
It's parse int. For some reason, it's probably the Google search I do the most often. And now we're back to 9. Yeah. So the problem is not that you have to write this, because once you know that it's parse int, and if you have a better memory than I have, then you never have to worry about it. It's just parse int and you have a number back. So having to use that is not a very big burden. But the fact that if you don't use it, JavaScript happily allows you to shoot yourself in the foot, that is a bit of a bigger issue. Okay, it is 5:30. So, well, this was very enjoyable. I think we would better stop. If you have questions or anything like that, some people already used that. That's very good. Just send me an email or post it on the Facebook group. I will think about what we will do next class. I thought I actually had topics that weren't going to take a full hour, but I stand corrected. So I will keep that in mind. If you have feedback on what we're doing or something you'd like to see or anything like that, then again, just post it or send me a mail. As I said in the beginning, this is the first time for me as well to do something like this. So I am absolutely open to feedback about it as well. If you want to send me penguins, that's also always possible. Okay, thank you very much. I hope it was clear. I'm not going to say enjoyable, but clear at least. If it wasn't, then let me know, and hopefully I will see you back next week. Have a great evening.